I turned him down because I was afraid of losing myself. And in the end, the man I kept refusing became the only place I ever truly felt safe. I was never the sort of girl who imagined a crown waiting for me. I grew up in Scotland at Glamis, in a world that felt rooted and safe. There was space there, family there, the kind of ordinary richness that does not look like history when you are living it, but becomes part of your whole character later. I was lucky, of course. I knew that, but I was not living under the weight of public eyes. I was a girl with a life of my own, and I valued that more than I could fully explain at the time. And perhaps that is why Bertie reached me the way he did. I met him in 1920, and I remember how different he was from the sort of man who tries to command a room. He did not rush into things. He did not make himself larger than he was. He was shy, almost painfully so, and he carried his stammer like a private struggle he would rather have hidden from everyone. But there was something about him that drew me in before I understood it properly. He was gentle. He was earnest. He was not grand. He was not trying to impress me with noise. He was trying, always trying, and that effort touched me. I think he loved me almost at once. He certainly looked at me in a way that made that plain, and he wrote to me with a warmth that slowly, over time, made it impossible to pretend he was only a pleasant acquaintance. His letters were not grand performances. They were full of feeling. He missed me. He told me so. He noticed my absence. He seemed to carry those separations far more deeply than I did at first, and I confess that part of me found that very moving. There was tenderness in him that people often miss if they only look at the crown later. At that time, though, I was not ready, and I want to be honest about why. People often think hesitation in love means indifference. It does not. Sometimes it means you understand the cost too clearly. I knew what royal life meant. I knew what marriage into that world would demand. I knew that becoming a princess, and later perhaps something far greater, would not simply mean wearing beautiful clothes and standing in front of cameras. It would mean surrendering parts of myself that I valued deeply. My freedom, my privacy, my unguarded life, the right to think and speak and act without feeling watched every minute of the day. That idea frightened me more than I can say. Not because I was vain about independence, and not because I did not care for him. I did care, deeply. But I had seen enough of royal life to know that once you entered it, it never really let you go. You could be loved by the public and still feel strangely isolated. You could live in great houses and still feel hemmed in. You could have every outward thing and still lose the inward sense that you belonged to yourself. And I was not eager to give that up. So I said no, more than once. That was not cruelty. It was fear. Plain fear. Fear of the future. Fear of losing my voice. Fear of becoming a woman who belonged to everyone except herself. And when you fear that kind of life, even a man you like very much can feel like a risk you are not sure you can survive. Bertie did not stop. He came back, again and again, with patience that told me everything I needed to know about him. That was one of the first signs that he was a man worth trusting. He did not pursue me with arrogance. He did not try to win me through force. He did not shame me for hesitating. He let me take my time. He let the feeling become real in its own season. And in the meantime, I learned more about him. Not just the prince, but the man. The man who could be awkward and sweet, serious and self-conscious, dutiful and quietly funny. The man who did not love in a shallow way. He loved as if the answer mattered. And because the answer mattered to him, it began to matter more to me too. There is a strange thing that happens when you keep returning to a person. At first, you notice the obvious parts. Then, if you are lucky, you begin to notice the private ones. The way he listened. The way he paused before speaking, as if every word should earn its place. The way he could make a very small joke and almost pretend not to enjoy it when it worked. The way his eyes softened when he was relieved. The way he could seem almost fragile in one moment and incredibly steady in the next. That was Bertie. He was not flamboyant. He was not effortless. He was not the sort of man who made everything look easy. He was, in many ways, vulnerable, but there was strength in that vulnerability. There was steadiness in it. He had a modesty that made him seem almost invisible at times, yet the more I knew him, the more I saw the enormous effort he made simply to be himself in public. He did not seek admiration. He sought to do the right thing, and he often did it with more courage than people ever understood. And little by little, my feelings changed. Not suddenly, not in a burst of music and light. More quietly than that, which is how real love often arrives. I started to admire his kindness. I started to notice his humor, which appeared in the gentlest little flashes. I started to understand that the very thing I feared in him, that sense of duty and order and seriousness, was also the thing that could make me feel safe. By the time I accepted him, the feeling in me had shifted from resistance to trust. And trust is a more serious thing than excitement. It lasts longer. It changes you more deeply. We became engaged in January 1923, and I remember that period as both thrilling and terrifying. It was one thing to love a man privately. It was another to step toward the full force of royal scrutiny. That part arrived almost immediately, and I do not think I was prepared for the speed of it. Suddenly, everyone knew. Suddenly, there were reporters, photographers, questions, assumptions, opinions, all pressing in from every side. It was a great deal to absorb all at once, and I wrote about it later with more honesty than I could show in public. I hated that my private life had become something others felt entitled to inspect, but there was another feeling underneath the discomfort: relief. Because after all that hesitation, I had finally chosen him, and he had chosen me so many times before. There is something very tender about that, if you think about it properly. He had made himself vulnerable to me again and again. He had asked. He had waited. He had not withdrawn his affection when I needed time. That patience taught me something about him that no title could ever express. He was loyal in the most important sense. He did not love in a shallow way. He loved as if the answer mattered. Our wedding in Westminster Abbey on the 26th of April, 1923, should have been only grandeur, but memory does not work like that. Memory keeps the private moments and the public ones together. I remember the Abbey itself, the scale, the solemnity, the echo of footsteps in ceremony, the weight of the day pressing in around me while the whole world seemed to look on. But I also remember the quiet thing I did before I walked up the aisle. I laid my bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior in memory of my brother Fergus, who had died in the First World War. That gesture meant everything to me. It was my way of carrying grief into joy without pretending the grief was not there. It was my way of saying that love is never untouched by loss, and that no marriage begins in a vacuum. We all arrive carrying someone or something we have lost. I did not do it for effect. I did it because it was true. Fergus had died. So many boys had died. And on a day that looked so magnificent from the outside, I needed to remember them. After that, the marriage became real in a different way. Not because of the ceremony, but because of the life that followed. We had a little world in those early years, before the responsibilities grew teeth. A real home, a marriage that could still laugh. That is important because people forget that royal couples are still couples. They have routines. They have private jokes. They have the ordinary smallness of life that matters far more than the public imagines. Bertie had a way of being serious that could make you smile if you knew him well enough. I had a way of teasing him, and sometimes he would try not to laugh and fail, which was always very satisfying. We were not theatrical in private. We were affectionate, careful, comforting to each other in the little moments that never reach the papers. There were letters too, of course, and letters can keep a marriage alive in ways that public history never properly respects. When we were apart, we wrote as if the distance itself had become part of the relationship. He could be wonderfully affectionate in writing. I could be playful, even a little daring, when I knew the words were only for him. That gave us a secret language. It made the bond feel alive long before the world thought of it as settled. And then our daughters came, and the house became a home in a fuller sense. Elizabeth, Margaret Rose, there is a special kind of love that arrives with children. It does not replace marriage, but it changes it. It deepens it. It gives it shape. Suddenly, the two of you are not just husband and wife. You are the center of a small universe that depends on your warmth, your patience, your steadiness. I loved being their mother. I loved the sound of their lives around me. I loved the way one could be so solemn and determined, while the other seemed born with mischief in her eyes. Those years mattered enormously, because they gave us something solid before the world tested us. There were family dinners, nursery routines, little visits, little jokes, and the kind of everyday happiness that only becomes precious later, when you look back and realize how quickly it was about to be interrupted. Queen Mary, George V, the household, the rhythm of the court, all of that existed around us, but our little circle was the thing that sustained me. We were building something before history came knocking at the door. Then, history did come knocking. Edward's abdication changed everything, and it did so with brutal speed. I had never wanted Bertie to become king. I knew enough about him to know what it would do to him. He was not the sort of man who wanted a crown as a prize. He was the sort of man who understood too clearly what duty costs. And when the crown was suddenly forced onto his head, I saw immediately that the strain would be immense. That is one of the things I could never quite forgive. Not because I was interested in scandal, but because I was his wife. Because I watched what it did to him. Because I knew that the burden he carried was not one he had chosen. Because I knew that once it landed on him, it would not leave him untouched. Edward, I think, was bemused with love. That was the polite explanation, and perhaps the only one that matters publicly. But public explanations do not heal private consequences. The private consequence was that my gentle husband, who had never wanted this path, was now standing where he never expected to stand. And I had to stand beside him and be strong when he was already carrying more than he should have had to carry. The coronation itself came with all the dignity and spectacle that history demands, but inside me there was a quiet dread too. I knew this was not a prize. I knew it was a weight, and I also knew that if I wanted him to survive it, I had to become the person he could lean on without fear of breaking. So I did. During the war, that became even more necessary. The Blitz changed everything again. London burned. People suffered. The country was forced to endure fear on a scale that none of us could ignore. And we refused to leave. That decision was not only political or symbolic. It was personal. It was our answer to terror. It was our way of saying that if the people had to endure this, then so would we. I remember the line so many people still know. The children will not leave unless I do. I shall not leave unless their father does. And the king will never leave the country in any case. That was not bravado. It was loyalty. And the strange thing about shared danger is that it can make marriage feel sharper, truer, almost unbearably close. There were nights when the bombs fell and all the world seemed reduced to a single dark room, a single breath, a single hand held in the darkness. There were moments when humor came in very small doses, just enough to keep us from being swallowed by fear. There were mornings when we went out to see the damage, and I could look people in the face because we had been wounded too. That mattered to me. Not because I wanted sympathy, but because suffering beside people creates a form of fellowship that cannot be faked. And Bertie, through all of it, kept going. That was the miracle of him, if you can call it that. He kept going. He did not become less afraid simply because he was king. He became more tired, more worn down, and still he rose. He gave speeches when every muscle in him must have been aching. He bore the pressure of being the man the country needed, even when I knew it was costing him dearly. And it did cost him dearly. He was a heavy smoker. Everyone knew it. He had health troubles after the war, and then more serious ones later. His body began to fail him in ways that were painful to watch. There is no elegance in that part of a love story. Only sorrow. Only that awful instinct to measure the damage and wonder how much of it could have been avoided if the life had been gentler, if the burden had been lighter, if history had been kinder to the man you love. I did blame Edward for a long time. Not in a scandalous, dramatic way, in a wife's way, in a way that comes from watching the strain on someone's face and knowing where the strain began. I believed, and I still believe, that the stress of that unwanted crown shortened Bertie's life. That knowledge never left me. It sat there quietly, like an old wound that does not bleed every day, but never fully heals. When he died in 1952, something in the world went silent. He was only 56. That is too young. It will always be too young. The house felt different at once. The air felt different. The future felt suddenly unfamiliar. I was the queen mother to the world, but privately, I was simply a widow. A woman whose husband had gone, leaving behind a life that had been built around him for decades. And the name never sat easily with me. Horrible name, I thought. Perhaps because it flattened a person into an office when what I had really been, all along, was his wife. After his death, I lived on for a very long time. That is its own strange burden. Widowhood can become a whole landscape of its own. You learn to carry memory without always speaking it. You learn to smile publicly while privately living with absence. You learn that love does not end just because the life it belonged to has ended. It changes form. It becomes habit, ritual, reflection, silence, loyalty that has nowhere left to go except inward. And so I carried him with me, not only in public duty, not only in family life, but in the smallest private moments, in the way I remembered the tone of his voice, in the way I remembered the quiet steadiness of his hand, in the way I remembered that he was never loud, never flamboyant, never trying to be larger than he was. He was simply Bertie. That was enough. It was always enough. I had once feared that marrying him would cost me my freedom. What I discovered, in the end, was more complicated and more precious than that. The marriage did ask for sacrifice. It asked for patience. It asked for loyalty through fear and grief and duty. But it also gave me a life I could not have imagined when I was young. It gave me love that lasted through war, through loss, through kingship, through widowhood. It gave me children. It gave me companionship. It gave me the one person who made the burden of the crown bearable. So, if you ask me what our marriage really was, I would not call it a fairy tale. I would call it real. It was shy beginnings, repeated proposals, fear, devotion, humor, duty, and grief. It was a private home built inside a public life. It was the story of a man who did not want to be king and a woman who did not want to lose herself, yet found in him the one person who made both things survivable. I said no because I was afraid. I said yes because I came to know the man behind the title. And in the end, after all the years, all the ceremonies, all the history, I still knew the simplest truth of all. I was Bertie's wife.